Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for joining us Wednesday of this week as we continue through the 9th chapter of the Gospel of John. Really, one pretty well-crafted story runs through this entire chapter. Where we are, if you haven't been with us the last couple of days, Jesus has healed a man that was born blind. This has caused some unhappiness from the religious leaders, Pharisees, on two fronts. A, that it was a Sabbath, and B, it's occasioned an argument about whether or not Jesus is able to do this and who Jesus is. Some really great themes that run through this chapter about seeing and not seeing. And then I think today we see also another theme developing, the idea of knowing and not knowing. So we are jumping in at verse 24. I'll read through about verse 34, 10 verses or so, then we'll come back and see what we find in it. So for the second time, they called the man who had been born blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner." He answered, "I don't know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to also become his disciples?" Then they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple. We are the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Well, this is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." Then they answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. As we've seen, I think, Michael, John gives us an escalation of the conflict. It starts with an issue. It then picks up with some conversation, with some argument. And now, interestingly enough, some of the most heated part of the discussion is with Jesus in the background, which is a little bit unusual in the gospel. Typically, Jesus is front and center in these kind of arguments, but the Pharisees now take it upon themselves to try and get to the bottom of this. So they say, "Give glory to God." In other words, admit that God did this. We don't think this man had anything to do with it, and he's a sinner. And a wonderful reply here. I don't know if he's a sinner. Here's the thing I know. I was blind, and now I see. And if that sounds familiar to you, that is the guiding, or it is the inspiration for the hymn Amazing Grace. John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, was drawn to that idea through this verse. And then they try to get to the bottom of, well, what did he do? How could he have done this? And then the man asks, well, I guess what, you want to be his disciples? And that's kind of when things ratchet up to 11, Michael.
There are so many threads within this text alone, yet alone the larger piece that we're seeing unfold here. I just want to point out a couple of them. And the first is, note the theme of sinner within this story itself. It starts off with that amazing nod here. We know that this man is a sinner, and the blind man who, it is really already been in this conversation. Did he sin? Did his parents sin? Right? You might remember the disciples asking Jesus that. Now we see that being teased out and pointed at Jesus. We know that Jesus is a sinner, but this man, who just previously everybody would have assumed was sick because, or was blind because of his sin or the sin of his parents, is now asked to give account to, is Jesus a sinner? Is he the one, is he acting in some evil or insipid way? And Clint, I think what's fascinating about this is the Pharisees are working against their own benefit in an argument of this form. They're going to a witness to try to mount a case against Jesus that they would have not held as a reputable witness from the jump. And yet they're going to turn to him to try to turn the tables on this man, Jesus, who they, at this point, have already been given ample motivation to want to kill. I mean, John has mentioned already numerous plots and the desire for Jesus's life to be taken. So what we have happening right in front of us here is a strange kind of reversal where the locus of who is the sinner is being sort of sought out by these religious leaders while treating this man in a very inhuman way. Looking at a man who's just healed and using him as argument against Jesus is in its way its own kind of sinfulness. And so John is doing this amazing sort of turn where the people obsessed with sin are the very people whose that sin lands on, the very people for whom sinfulness could be most accurately, applied or ascribed. And so I think, Clint, it's just that's one small aspect that has gone now through the story, but we're beginning to see John flesh it out. And I think it's done to great literary effect.
I agree. And I think this is where two of those themes come together. We've been saying for the last couple of days that one of the powerful threads of this text is the idea of what is obvious. In other words, what is seen and what is missed. And so these men, they don't see what's in front of them. They've already gotten a conclusion, and it keeps them blinded. And so now we have this wonderful reversal where the ones who can't see are criticizing the one whose blindness has been healed. And then there's the idea of knowledge, of knowing. We know this man is a sinner. And the other man says, well, I don't know that. I know that he healed my blindness. And I know that God does good things, and nobody's ever talked about people being healed of their blindness. And don't you think that that means something? Here's an astonishing thing. You don't know where he comes from, but he opened my eyes. So in other words, what is obvious to the man who used to be blind is now hidden from the ones who think they can see. And what they think they know is the opposite, exactly the opposite of what is reality that is observable and obvious to even those who can barely see. And so John is just doing a really nice job here of weaving this all together. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the one who worships him and obeys his will. If the man were not from God, he could do nothing. So interestingly enough, this is the statement of the blind man. He looks at his situation, he now sees, and where it leads him is if this man wasn't from God, he couldn't do these things. So what's the implication? He's clearly from God. And it's at this point where affirming Jesus sets the Pharisees off the most. They insult him, they accuse him of being born in sin, and they drive him out. In other words, they rid him, or rid the temple, the synagogue, not the temple, the synagogue of him. And if you remember where we started this text, you see that John again has done a really beautiful job of bringing this full circle. You were born entirely in your sin. So remember that this whole episode starts when Jesus and the disciples see a blind man, and the disciples ask, who sinned? Whose sin was the problem that this man would be blind? And Jesus says, no, this man is about to show the glory of God. And now, having done that, the very ones who should know better see instead and accuse this man instead of being born in sin, of being steeped in sin, entirely in sin. Just a really nice, simple literary mechanism here to show us how far the Pharisees are from the mark, and that this man who just beginning this passage, this chapter, was blind, what he now sees about Jesus.
There's a really explicit reference to evangelism and discipleship in this text that I don't think we should miss. It comes right here in verse 27 when the Pharisees uh, are asked by this man, I've told you and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? John uses questions like this so impactfully, Clint. And this is a question that both rings with a note of sarcasm, a note of rhetoric or argument, right? Like, what more do you actually want? And simultaneously, I think is in many ways a wholehearted question. What is the thing that you want to get from this line of questioning? Because there's a nod here, there's a tip here that if you are engaging in questioning Christ with an outcome already in mind, you will get that outcome, right? If you come to Jesus and you are dead set that I'm going to interrogate you to prove that you are a sinner, not in the line of Moses, but in the line of self-aggrandizement, in a heretical teacher. If you come to Jesus and your expectation is that he is this thing, then this story serves as a unbelievable illustration that there's no amount of evidence, not even the man that you walked by every day, your neighbor who was blind, you will not even recognize who that man is when God is done with him because you are so dead set on the outcome that you preconceived. And so that question, right? Like, do you want to be his disciple? Is that the goal? Or is there something else? And of course, they're not interested in being his disciple. They're interested in catching him and being able to sort of turn the plot against him. And in John, it's not Jesus's time, so that won't go their way. But they'll keep at it until they get their ends.
There's also, I think, that sense, Michael, we saw this, remember that the Pharisees go to the man's parents and they say, tell us about your son. And they say, go ask him.
Right.
Go to the source. And now the man says, do you want to be his disciples? And why are you talking to me about whether he's a sinner or not? Here's what I know. I was blind and now I see. Do you want to follow him? Well, go to him. And so again, part of the plotting of the Pharisees is to not deal with Jesus directly, but to try and find some reason to be unhappy with him and something that will bring the situation to what they've already decided, that Jesus is off base. And the story itself keeps just pushing us toward, well, go to the source, go to the source, go to Jesus, go ask him, go listen to him, go watch what he does. And it is really interesting how John particularly, I think I would say this, I'll push back, Michael, how John particularly uses the Pharisees to push a theme to the reader. There's conflict with the Pharisees in all the Gospels. That's built in. But I think John uses their characters especially well to push the reader to join in on some of the debates and discussions and to make a decision about what we see when we encounter these stories of Jesus.
I think there's a different tone, Clint, because I think of the accusations that Jesus makes against the Pharisees, whitewashed tombs, or he calls down different sort of warnings against Jerusalem. I think what you have in John is the Pharisees stand as a representative sample of those who are so close and spiritually as far away as you can possibly be. I think they're a warning sign on the road of faith that look at these people who deny actual healing, that a man who could uncontrovertibly be claimed as a miracle story. No one here after they confirm that this isn't some kind of dupe or switch, right? That this man was the one that they all knew to be blind. He's now healed. With that now settled, they move on to, by what power is this Jesus doing this? Because he's clearly not doing it from God's power. They move on to the next thing that needs sort of sought after. And I think what's really telling about that is they deny the physical reality itself. And I think that's what makes his statement here in verse 30 so powerful, Clint. And yet he opened my eyes. It is that simple. For a book that's all about metaphor and complex theology and all of these nuances, which we say over and over again, this book is also unbelievably simple. It's human. It's flesh and blood. This man, you can just imagine this moment where this man says, "Guys, I'm not here to debate theology with people. I'm here to tell you what happened to me. That's all I've got to say. I was blind. Now I see." And by the way, the moment he does that simple reflection of what has happened to him, he's witnessing, he's discipling, he's inviting these Pharisees to question the assumption that they're coming to him with. I think that that's exactly what John wants us to see, is that evangelism, sharing the faith, witnessing to what God has done in our life, is not some complicated, messy, scientific process that you need to have a PhD to do. No, it's very simply you seeing in your own life the things that God has done or is doing, and then you simply giving voice to that to other people as an invitation for them to see the same in their own life. That's it. John's not looking here in all of its nuances. John's not looking to make this more complicated than it is. I was blind, now I see. The character of the person who can make the world right when it's broken is enough for me. And that's all that there is to it. Would you like to be his disciple too, or is this all in jest? Are you just after chasing windmills? And that's the question that the Pharisees will, quite frankly, not answer correctly. And the same question that we're tempted to answer the same way.
There is, I mean, I think one of the takeaways here is that there is an obviousness to this story. There's oddness in it. Jesus makes mud for whatever that maybe meant, and perhaps we're not sure any longer what it did or didn't mean, so we guess at that. But when it comes to the act itself, Jesus encounters a man whose sin is blamed for his condition, and Jesus frees him of that condition while simultaneously declaring that it was not his sin, but that his life and the moment he's in is an opportunity for the glory of God to be seen. And who can't see it? The self-righteous. Everyone else can see it. Even the blind man can see it. I know that he's from God. Right? But those who refuse, and tomorrow as this story comes to the conclusion, we're going to hear this pronouncement against blindness, and John will bring it all to kind of a head as we see what it really means to see and what it means to remain blind. Well, I just think this is this may be my favorite chapter in the book of John. I think it probably is.
It's an important word to make sure that you join us tomorrow, because it does come to a head, and that's not just a saying that you make. That's the reality of what John's trying to do, is point us to the head.
Yeah, he's been taking us somewhere.
Exactly right. And the culmination of this story, in a human sense, could simply be, and we might be tempted to think it's the human aspect. Like, look at this man who's got his sight back. Look at this man who's being mistreated by these Pharisees. I mean, these are real things. But John wants to show us, and make sure to join us tomorrow to see how this comes together, because John wants us to see that this all rises and falls upon who Jesus is. And your response to who Jesus is 100% related to this massive turn that all of history has taken when God entered reality. When the light comes into darkness, the darkness is in its nature transformed. It's changed. It's chased away. And we're going to discover how that is lived out, not in theological grandiose terms, in real human lives. What happens when when darkness encounters the light, when the light comes into it, everything changes. And John is going to show us that. Don't miss it tomorrow.
Yeah, hope you can be with us.